So the question I'm asking here is, given this test case that we've already talked about, is it possible that I can conclude without trying it that this test case will succeed? And what this test case does is, enqueues 7, sleeps for a while, dequeues an element, and then checks if it was 7. And the answer again is yes. And again, it depends on making an argument about the actual form of the code for our queue. And so if you recall that code, the code didn't contain any dependencies on the time at which queue requests arrive. Just to be clear, we're trying to make arguments that a single test case is representative of a whole class of actual executions of the system that we're testing. And in the general case, we can't make those arguments. We can only make these arguments for the specific queue code that we're talking about because we know that, for example, it doesn't depend on the integer value that we're adding. It doesn't depend on the time at which operations are made, and that's why these arguments actually work. And so what we're actually getting at here is a fairly deep idea. And the idea is we have a single test case represents a point in the input space for the system that we're testing. By running the code, we map that point in the input space to a single point in the output space. But the problem is there's an extremely large input space, and we can't test it all. And so what we're trying to do here is build up an intuition for when we can make an argument that, in fact, we haven't made an argument about the mapping of a single input to a single output, but rather some class of inputs that are closely related, that are somehow equivalent for purposes of the system under test, and that if the system executes correctly for the single input that we've tried, that it's going to execute correctly for all of the inputs in this particular little bit of the input space. Let's look at a few ways in which the arguments that we've made here could have gone wrong. So is it ever the case that our queue could work for some integer, but not work for general integers? And certainly it is the case. For example, if the Python runtime contained some sort of a bug where large integers were truncated, then it would obviously be the case that if we put one of those large integers into our queue, it would get truncated somewhere in the queue processing here, and what would come out wouldn't be what we had tried to put in. Similarly, if the Python runtime contained some sort of a garbage collection bug that corrupted heap memory, it might be the case that sleeping would give the Python interpreter time to corrupt our value, time to corrupt our queue, and we wouldn't get something out. But in both of these cases here, we're making arguments about the broader runtime system and not the actual code under test. And remember that the arguments that we made here really only applied, they're really only about the actual code that we were testing. So in summary, we can make these kind of arguments, but we have to be extremely careful that the assumptions that those arguments are based on are good ones. What I'd like to do now is give you a little quiz about these concepts.